Hi, Glenn.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks. And you?
I am not going to complain about anything right now.
Good.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. And you are Glenn Loury, famously of The Glenn Show, among other sources of your fame. Both of our shows run on bloggingheads.tv. Actually, some of mine run on Bloggingheads' sister channel, meaningoblife.tv. But this is, I guess, kind of a crossover edition. We're going to actually, I'm gonna interview you.
I'm in the hot seat.
You're in the hot seat, and I'm going to put this both in my podcast feed, the Wright Show feed, and in yours, with your permission, the Glenn Show feed, and then maybe down the road, if you're sufficiently antagonized by this, you can retaliate by doing the same with me. Who knows?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
So this is a good time to be interviewing you because rumor has it that you've been working on your memoirs.
I have been, and I am.
How's that going?
Oh, not as cleanly and quickly as I would like it to, but I'm, making a lot of progress, and I'm feeling good about it. So I'm plugging away, thinking that there really is no deadline except my own demise, and hopefully that's not around the corner.
Don't let the conversation turn dark this early, Glenn.
I'm discovering a lot of things about myself. I'm plumbing the depths. I have occasional flights of literary excellence, I hope and think. So I'm optimistic about the project.
You have a name for the book yet? You don't have to review it. What's that?
Changing My Mind.
Oh, that's right. You mentioned that to John, I think, didn't you? John McWhorter, your frequent conversation partner on the Glenn Show.
I believe I have mentioned it, to John and others. Yeah.
By the way, in case there's anybody who doesn't know you from the Glenn Show, we should add that you're a noted economist at Brown University and so on. And aren't you a member of what's the elite, the most elite, the American Academy of Letters? What is it?
I am a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences.
Arts and Sciences. That's like the most elite thing for it's the non-athletic equivalent of the Hall of Fame or something, right?
Well, in the U.S. Academy in the Humanities and the Social Sciences, it's right up there. I think the National Academy of Sciences is perhaps a little bit more prestigious if you're a quantitative social science person. But, I'm not complaining. Yes, I've been honored. The American Philosophical Society, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So let me, I want to use the fact that you're working on your memoir to, to try to see if I can make you uncomfortable or elicit any other interesting reactions. Don't worry, I won't start with the uncomfortable part right away. Let me ask you. Let's start at an abstract philosophical plane. How should one, looking back, evaluate one's life? What? Not just for an academic, for anybody. What would you want to be able to say about your life as you look back? What is a life well lived?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about I call it the problem of self-regard. Okay, so, the first thing to understand about me is that I'm a theorist. In my field, I'm an abstract, guy that tries to think about the big ideas and stuff, not just the data, not just the specific question, but the broader, more general, more philosophical. So I undertake a project, namely writing about my own life. And of course, I have to theorize the project. I have to have a meta account, the account of the account, so honesty, self-honesty, that's kind of my first self-understanding, self-knowledge, avoiding self-delusion, self-aggrandizement. It's so easy to prettify, to look back and to rationalize and to sort of not face the truth about oneself. So for me, that problem of self-knowledge is right there.
So it sounds like this may be a more candidly revealing memoir than many, because so many of these kind of autobiographical things are such obvious exercises in impression management, and public relations. I mean, especially maybe politicians more than others. I don't know. It'd be interesting to go through the vocations and see what kinds of people you would hope would produce the most honest accounts of themselves. But it sounds like for you, this issue is very, very front and center.
It is, for a number of reasons. You say the problem of self-presentation. I think of Irving Goffman, the late great sociologist, the presentation of self in everyday life. He made quite a good living, I think, out of posing this, this ubiquitous thing where we have to manage how it is that other people perceive us. We control the information that they have about us. And if you're in the position of writing an autobiographic essay or whatever, you're right there in the driver's seat, controlling the material that you put in front of other people about yourself. And therefore, the credibility of what you do is on the table. The question of the credibility of what you do, the reader has to ask, well, he's telling me this, and he's telling me this in this particular way. What is he not telling me? Why is he telling me this? Why did he set the stage this way? The reader has to assume that the autobiographical essay is manipulating the presentation of the information on behalf of whatever his project is. So getting the reader to believe in the sincerity of the enterprise is a problem. And therefore, discrediting information about oneself might actually, at the end of the day, be crediting to the larger project. By buying credibility from the reader. Oh, he told me that. Wow, he told me that. Maybe he's on the up and up with me about what he's saying about his life, something like that.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned in a recent conversation with John McWhorter something that had made you had made a very uncomfortable discovery about yourself in the course of rereading your work from a certain period. I don't want to jump to that right away, but so let's continuing at a somewhat abstract level. Have you thought about not many economists write like autobiographies, right? Not a whole lot. I'm trying to think. I assume that somebody like John Maynard Keynes maybe did. I don't know if he did. Does anybody ever say to you, what is it about yourself that warrants your being one of the very few economists whose self-account I'm expected to be interested in?
Well, until this moment, no one has said that.
Well, I take pride in that. If this is the first time you're being made uncomfortable by this particular question, I can call today a success from my end.
Now, if I were only an economist or writing about my life in economics, I think I might not be doing the project at all. I wonder whether or not it would engender enough interest. Let's start with one thing. In my academic work as an economist, I've spent a lot of time writing about race and racial inequality. I've got a ton of papers out there about affirmative action. I'm not talking about editorials or op-ed pieces or punditry. I'm talking about academic research papers where I've tried to think as an economist about the resource allocation and, information theoretic aspects of, preferential hiring and student selection policies and things of this kind. Just to give that as one example. So economists, my PhD dissertation, essays in the theory of income distribution, half of which is a dynamic theory of racial income differences. So I'm writing about race, but I'm also living race. I'm the first African-American to be a tenured professor of economics at Harvard. I came up through the 1960s and 70s during a time of upheaval, civil rights movement and all of that. The question of race and racial inequality has been central for me politically, central for me personally, but also it is one of the fields in which I've been pursuing my interest as a scholar, as an economist. And therefore, writing about that from the point of view of a guy from the south side of Chicago who's working class, finds himself at MIT, bright enough to be there, but maybe not entirely sure of himself, finds himself in the Ivy League. Again, bright enough to be there if you'll allow that, but maybe not entirely sure of himself. Dealing with questions that are controversial, that are politically sensitive. It should be no surprise to anybody who's listened to the Glenn Show that I've come from somewhat from a conservative point of view on some of the race questions that has, made my contribution to public discussion more than of passing interest. Oh, he's a black guy and he's criticizing affirmative action. He's a black guy and he's not sure reparations is the greatest thing. Or he's worried about welfare undermining the incentives of poor people who are dependent on public assistance. He's a black guy who thinks the minimum wage is not the answer to the problem of low wage employment, et cetera. Yeah.
Now, in that regard, have you kind of come full circle? In other words, I don't know, 40 years ago or something, you were thought of, I don't know if I have the dates exactly right, but you were thought of as a conservative African-American intellectual. I don't think African-American was the term of art in those days, but whatever. Then you went through a period where you moved to the left significantly, it seemed. And by the way, I actually have a memory that of you that I'm sure is not matched at your end by memory of me. But there's a time when we were in the same room in the, I guess, was this late 80s, early 90s? When did Charles Murray's book come out, The Bell Curve? Whenever it came out.
It was 94.
Okay, so they had a thing at AEI, American Enterprise Institute, where I guess he was at that point.
He was.
And they had a little symposium to promote the book, and I was at that point at the New Republic. I was invited. You were there. I remember you giving off the vibe of not being happy with that book. I gave off that vibe actually in print in the New Republic. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if I went back and you and I both contributed to the same issue of the New Republic, because there was an issue almost completely devoted to that. And I had my issues with Murray's analysis. You had yours. Now at that point, and I'm not saying you've necessarily departed from the position you held on that particular issue since then, but since then you would say you've moved to the right. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. I was a liberal before I was a conservative, before I was a liberal, before I was a conservative, kind of thing like that. I mean, when I came out of Chicago to MIT, the graduate school, I was as predictably progressive liberal as you would expect any African-American working class person to be. But I did move to the right. And during the 1980s, I was a Reagan Republican.
What accounts for that change?
I point to a couple of things. One of them was that I drank the Kool-Aid on neoliberalism. And I guess I'm still drinking it to a certain degree. I mean, I became an economist. And although I was at MIT, which would have thought of itself as distinctly to the left of the Chicago school, I have tremendous respect for the Chicago school and for the insights of the Milton Friedmans and the Gary Beckers of the world and the George Stiglers of the world and people of this kind about markets, about the Friedrich von Hayeks of the world is perhaps how I should put this. I can remember reading Road to Serfdom. I can remember reading Law, Legislation, and Liberty as early in my career and being very impressed by the power of this way of thinking. So there was my market-oriented kind of distrust of central planning and big government and a kind of belief in the power, the sort of liberating power of people pursuing their own interests, Adam Smith style and whatnot, on the one hand. On the other hand, I was traumatized by my experience in the late 70s and early 80s I was at the University of Michigan for a few years. The city of Detroit, really just collapsed before my eyes, and thinking that a lot of what was wrong had to do with some of the cultural criticisms of the government programs and also of general changes in American culture, the collapse of the family and all this kind of stuff that was very much a part of the social criticism world back in the 1980s and early 1990s. I mean, I thought Dan Quayle was right about the Murphy Brown thing. No one's going to remember what I'm talking about.
Right.
This is Dan Quayle giving a speech criticizing a television show for portraying a woman unmarried having a child. And there then ensued a whole big debate in American pop culture about whether or not a woman having a child without a husband was a good or a bad thing.
That's an interesting moment in history because he was vice president then. And that what his point about Murphy Brown, I think, was to some extent embedded in a larger theme that he developed, possibly with Bill Kristol, who was at that point his, I don't want to say guru, but was certainly providing input into his brain. Which
he was his chief of staff.
Yeah, he was his chief of staff. Okay. And by some accounts, providing input into Dan Quayle's brain was a job somebody had to do, but I won't pursue that any further.
This is the guy who could not spell potato, if I recall the.
That's my recollection. But one of the themes they developed was something that's become a huge part of American political discourse, a critique of the, quote, cultural elites. I think they use that phrase and fostering, I think, a kind of resentment on the right of these kind of coastal cultural elites who had, indifference, if not indifference to, if not contempt for, the needs and values of everyday middle Americans and so on. That was a theme that they started to develop back then. And Murphy Brown was an example of a liberal elite, that show.
Yeah.
Embodying these values that were being imposed on America by people who didn't understand the real problems that real people have, that in real, that at lower income levels than Murphy Brown, the TV character Murphy Brown was living at, having a child without somebody to help you raise it was not necessarily a good idea. That was the Dan Quayle critique. But I think of that as, in a way, the beginning of a conversation that's still being had. But that's a little bit of a digression. So
yeah, I was just saying I was on the left coming out of Chicago and going to graduate school. I moved right somewhat under the influence of the intellectual evolution of becoming an economist and somewhat in reaction to things that were going on in American political economy and culture. But I had a epiphany, or a series of epiphanies, really. I went through a very traumatic period in my life where of scandal and public humiliation. I went through a religious conversion, became a practicing Christian. And in this period of transition, I reevaluated my political outlook, and I began to move left. And when that 1994 conference, I remember it very well. I don't remember you at the conference, Bob.
No, you wouldn't. I don't think anybody in that room would. But
Mary Ann Herrnstein had put out this book, and it was going to go on and sell hundreds of thousands of copies, and it was a real event in American political culture. And it, amongst other things, lent support to the outlook about inequality and race, in which genetic differences between racial groups would be a factor in accounting for the disparity. I think that's a generous way of putting it. And I was extremely dubious about that intellectual move. It was not the only book being published in those years that gave me pause. Dinesh D'Souza was also at the American Enterprise Institute, and he put out a scurrilous book called The End of Racism, which I had contempt for. Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom were writing in those years about race, and their book came out a couple of years after Mary Ann Herrnstein. American Black and White, I wrote a very critical review of Abby and Steve's book. I say Abby and Steve because they were my friends. And my review that was published by Jack Beatty in The Atlantic, 7,500 words, took them apart chapter and verse, and they never forgave me for it. But I went through this period of deep reaction against my own conservatism, and I moved to the left, very self-consciously so. And this went on for years. I mean, it culminated in the first decade of this century when I turned my attention to the issue of mass incarceration. I gave these lectures out at Stanford. I published a small book, MIT Press, on race, incarceration, and American values. And I don't think anyone can read it without seeing it as a left of center critique of the criminal justice system. It influenced Michelle Alexander. She thanks me the author of The New Jim Crow, in her introduction for helping to move her in that direction. So I was left, and I was right, then I was left. But the post-Ferguson climate on racial issues is causing me to reevaluate some of my sort of disquiet with the way that affirmative action has evolved, and my dislike for the tenor of some of the popular rhetoric coming out, people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and whatnot, about the race issue. I find myself back kind of right of center on those issues again.
So it sounds like the as far as your initial drift to the right, it had to do partly with a purely intellectual attraction to, let's face it, the beauty of certain aspects of just kind of classical economics, kind of Adam Smith's books. I mean, whatever you think about the market and how things wind up being distributed, it is an extremely powerful mechanism and embodies certain kinds of efficiencies. And once you understand those efficiencies, that has a very powerful appeal, especially if you compared them, as Hayek did, to an alternative system where the decision making is centralized and all the inefficiencies that arise from that, which of course were manifest in, for example, the Soviet economy and so on. So it sounds like there's the intellectual appeal to that. It sounds like there is also, with reference to the Murphy Brown thing, you're having grown up, let's just say, in the real world more than perhaps some liberal intellectuals had, and having a kind of a reality check that you could impose on some ideas of the left that you might think were, a little too detached from reality. Is that a fair summary of two sources of the initial appeal of the right?
It is a fair summary. I mean, in the real world, I grew up on the south side of Chicago.
That's very real. That's very real, as I understand.
Working class. There was a lot of stuff going on that, I don't know that anybody could really credit it as kind of constructive or helpful to the well-being of the micro society in which I was a part. And a cultural criticism of that seemed entirely warranted. I also grew up not especially religious, but in a milieu that honored religious faith, that took it seriously. Mm-hmm. I was not, indoctrinated with any particular, religious theological thing, but still, people took religion really quite seriously, and reference to God was really quite commonplace. It was a relatively culturally conservative milieu. Gay rights was not the most popular kind of, innovation of thinking in the community that I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. Of course, things have changed since then. But, I watched what was going on in Detroit, and I was simply appalled by, the crime and the disorder, and also by what I thought to be the inadequacy of the knee-jerk liberal response to it, which was that it was all about racism, and if we could just up the budget on a social program, things are going to be better. I was a long way from being convinced that was true.
Yeah, but I would guess that you might say that looking back, that was a more on-point liberal response than what you're hearing now, because as I understand it, your critique of a lot of the current handling of race on the left is that there's a tremendous amount of attention to like just changing the words people use and the way they talk about things, as opposed to much in the way of an emphasis on policy. Now, there is reparations, which you think is for various reasons probably not a great idea, but but this is part of your current critique is that I gather is that there's a lot of time spent trying to change things that are not really substantive, that just changing the atmospherics. Is that?
Yeah, and holding people to account for not virtue signaling or insisting upon relatively minor obeisance, obeisance to what I regard to be as relatively minor strictures about how you're supposed to think and what you're supposed to say. So this is, I think it's kind of clear what
attracted you to the right, then your turn to the left, on the one hand, had to do with this difficult period in your life when you were using drugs and whatever, and had kind of a double life for a while, I guess. On the one hand, this noted Harvard professor, on the other hand, something that the faculty didn't know about, and your emergence from that is am I understanding correctly, was which was also intertwined in an important way with a suddenly prominent role of evangelical religion in your life. That was part of your recovery, right? From
that's right.
substance abuse and so on. And that was a big that was a big phase as far as the drift to the left goes.
Yeah, I don't mind telling people I was up for an appointment in the Reagan administration second term, where Bill Kristol, who had been my colleague at the Kennedy School earlier in the 1980s and was then working for William Bennett inside of the Reagan administration, had put me forward for an appointment. And I had to withdraw from it in the midst of public scandal because I was keeping a young mistress in an apartment in the South End of Boston, and she and I got into a fight. It became quite public, and I was no longer fit for service in the government, and I withdrew. And in the depressive, kind of reaction, the depression of the post, kind of dealing with this public humiliation and whatnot, I found myself in a hole with drug addiction, cocaine, and it almost destroyed my life. And I had to go into rehab. I lost about a year in halfway houses and, inpatient rehab. And my marriage barely held together, but it did hold together, to my wife, Linda, who's deceased now. She died of breast cancer 8 years ago. But in any case, we went on to have two fine sons. The older of them is 30 years old now. It's quite a ways back. But at the time, I've got religion. Yeah. And I started rethinking a lot of things from the ground up. And one of them was the political philosophy that I had been embracing in some of my associates. And I ended up moving to the left, although not in one step. I mean, as you say, I was an evangelical, and I was friendly with some people who were pretty conservative, like Charles Colson, the Nixon henchman who served time in prison in the Watergate scandal, and came out. He himself was converted to Christianity in prison. He came out as an evangelist and started a ministry called Prison Fellowship Ministries. He invited me to serve on his board in the early 1990s, and I happily did so, and served for several years and got to know some of these operators on the right.
Let me ask you let me ask you to get a little psychoanalytic, maybe.
Okay.
This phase where you were, that led to scandal. You were doing cocaine. You had this secret mistress. Now, first of all, let me say that in general, when people behave like that, I don't think it needs a special explanation. Sex and drugs feel good. It's like whenever somebody says to me, oh, they're addicted to drugs, they must have a self-destructive impulse. I'm like, well, no, they took the drug. It felt good. They took more. It felt good. I don't think we need a special explanation here. So if that's your explanation, fine. But I feel compelled to ask, was there any part of your entering that world that had to do with how different your identity was and your cultural origins were from those of the average Harvard faculty member? Does it? I don't just mean in the sense that you grew up maybe more aware of crack cocaine or grew up more aware, more conversant in that world than some of your peers of upper middle class origin. I mean, was there any kind of, was there a subtext of reaction against what Harvard represented or anything like that?
Yeah. How shall I put it? I was proud of the fact that I could handle myself on the streets of Boston after midnight, that I could go into the courtyard of a housing project, get what I wanted, and come out alive because I knew how to dress, I knew how to walk and talk. I knew who to look in the eye and not look away from, who to not look in the eye or mess around with. I knew the slang. I knew how to carry myself. Most of my colleagues at Harvard wouldn't have known, and, no reason why they should have known. Most of my Black colleagues at Harvard, I thought, would not have been nearly as adept and artful as was I in negotiating the ins and outs of, quote, the ghetto, close quote. So I was proud of that. And I think some of what was going on with me, again, this is self-psychoanalysis, so you guys are going to have to take it for what it's worth, was that in my struggle with my identity and my authenticity, I'm moving between worlds. I don't want only to be a Harvard Don. I don't want to not be Black in some sense. And this is, I say it with trepidation because, of course, the essence of being Black hardly should be identified with the scummiest aspects of ghetto life. It shouldn't be associated with patronizing prostitutes or buying drugs pushed under a housing project door jam where you slide the bill under and then the drugs come out wrapped in a little piece of paper and you run around furtively. That's not real ghetto. That's not real African-American life. But somehow, perversely in my mind, I felt more authentically Black, being able to negotiate those transactions. So that certainly added to it. And it's ironic.
So was it in a way a way to avoid having sold out your culture?
I don't think there was ever a point where I quite consciously said to myself anything of the sort. But I think in retrospect, one reason that I persisted in certain patterns of activity had to do with it placating a sense within myself that I was selling out or that I was losing touch with. I'd forgotten who I was or where I came from, something like that. And the ability to juxtapose these things, by the way, I mean, what can be more elevating of one's sense of power and command in the world than to be able to stand in a seminar room at the Kennedy School of Government and lecture to 250 people and have them applauding wildly at the end by day. And then, be able to change your garb, put on a funny hat, go to the club and pick somebody up and whatever by night, man. That's like being a master of the universe.
Clark Kent by day, Superfly by night.
Hey, I like it.
Our younger viewers may not recognize the term Superfly. So you moved, and did part of the move to the left have to do with such mundane things as, hey, the Reagan administration just rejected me, right? Like,
no, not really. And they didn't. I mean, of course, I was unfit for public office after the scandal, but they didn't exactly reject me. The world of which from which I would have been drawn, the world of neoconservative and conservative intellectuals, the people editing the magazines, Norman Podhoretz at Commentary, or with Neil Kazadoy, or Martin Peretz at the New Republic. He was still my buddy, even though I was scandalized. He still wanted to see me in the pages of the New Republic. And the public interest, the people like Nat Glazer and Irving Kristol and James Q. Wilson and whatnot, they understood, I was fallen, but I was still a part of the community of conservative intellectuals trying to save the country from liberalism. They didn't abandon me. So no, it wasn't that. Iconically, I can't remember the exact year, maybe 1996, 97. There's the 50th anniversary of Commentary magazine, which is being celebrated at Harvard. They had a big conference. And there was a dinner at the Hasty Pudding in Harvard Square on the occasion of this, and Norman Podhoretz gave an address. And Norman said, we're all conservatives now. There's no such thing as neoconservatives. And that was then, this is now, that's over, we're all conservatives. And I objected. And in my formal remarks the next day, I objected at length. And I said, look, I didn't sign up for this. I signed up for the liberals have their heads up their butts. They're wrong about crime. They're wrong about welfare. They're wrong about a lot of stuff. They're wrong about housing policy. They don't know how to run cities. They're wrong. But I still cared about the people. I wanted to do so. I wanted to do it right. I still wanted to help the poor Black people in the ghettos. I just thought the liberals didn't know how to do it. You're now telling me that that was all a waste of time, that we have to abandon those objectives. The critique is not just a critique of methods, it's a critique of ends. The liberals have the wrong ends in wanting to solve the problem of poverty, to include the excluded, to reduce the racial gaps, and they have the wrong objectives. I couldn't buy that. I felt, at least the Glenn Loury of the early 1990s felt that that was giving up something that, was morally problematic. The issue now was not policy. The issue was ends. And I became convinced that many of my conservative friends didn't give a damn about stuff that I really cared about.
So let me be clear. How were they articulating the ends now, the neoconservatives and other conservatives?
Well, they were basically saying there's not a whole lot that we can do about it, and let's move on.
Right. People are not much aware of, not these days, so aware of Charles Murray's earlier book. I forget the title.
Losing Ground.
Okay, that's the one. Was the one about kind of the? It was about the perverse incentives, in his view, presented by welfare policy.
That's correct.
Be better off just offering them. I don't want to oversimplify, but you'd be better off just offering them nothing, and make them pull up their socks and work, because as long as they can get paid to sit at home, they'll sit at home. So there's part of that milieu that you were reacting against when you moved to the left?
Yeah, you could say that. It's not just Charles Murray's losing ground. It's rehabilitation doesn't work. The purpose of prison is to keep criminals away from law-abiding people and to express society's contempt for the antisocial behavior that they engaged in. But it's not to make them fit for, be able to re-enter society as productive members or whatever. Because after all, there's no reason to believe that anything that you can do will have any beneficial impact on the outcome.
Okay. And so then, now I know in a recent conversation with John McWhorter, you looked back at some of the pieces you were writing after your turn against the right, and you felt almost ashamed, it sounds like, of how performative they seemed to you now, as if you were like trying to burnish your new liberal credentials and show off in front of the proper liberals. And so that is your perception now of the writing you were doing then?
Some of it, yeah. I mean, for example, let's take Charles Murray. Let's take not losing ground. Let's take the bell curve. So I disagreed and disagree with much of the argument in the bell curve, insofar as the author's attempt to explain persistent social disparities between racial groups by reference to genetic inheritance. I'm not persuaded as a social scientist that they're correct about that. On the other hand, I don't think that Charles Murray is a racist. I don't. Today, in the year 2019, I would not call Charles Murray a racist. He's not a white supremacist. This is Glenn Loury, me, today, 2019. He has the ideas that he has. He's a libertarian guy. He's a social critic. He comes from the right. He doesn't trust social policy. He's willing to, raise questions that other people wouldn't raise and whatnot. I don't necessarily agree with him in every respect, but I don't think he's a racist. And I wrote some pieces in the New Republic in the late 1990s in which I basically called him a racist. I didn't use those words, but I basically called him a racist. I mean, I jumped on the bandwagon of complaint about the perniciousness of his, willingness to raise these issues. In retrospect, I might question the political desirability of framing a public discussion a certain way. I might question the social scientific acuity. Do the data, in fact, demonstrate what it is that he alleges? But I wouldn't try to run Charles Murray out of polite society. He's not the guy that I want to throw a pie in his face when he appears on a college campus or whatever. I don't believe that I would want to excise from the agenda of a psychometrician a systematic scientific inquiry into certain questions about whether or not natural differences between population groups are implicated in this or that aspect of social disparity. I would want to parse it on a case-by-case basis based upon the data. Now, if I'm the chairman of the National Academy and the question is, what do we devote our intellectual resources to? I've got 100 things in line before that one as the question that I want to ask. But if there's some guy called Charles Murray sitting in his cottage somewhere who wants to cogitate and pull it together, let's just argue it out on the basis of what he says and not on the basis of who we think he is or what kind of racist we think he is, this kind of thing. I give that as one example. There are other examples.
Let me just take a quick detour and ask: do you have a good working definition of racist? It's a word that's often used and rarely defined.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm not going to give you a dictionary definition, but I would say something like a person who has unreasoning contempt or disdain based on the race of another person, a person who believes a set of things without factual foundation that are discrediting, blacks are lazy, Jews are greedy, can't be trusted, things of this kind.
Okay. So strong affective reaction against the group along with unfounded beliefs that support the hostility, the antagonism.
Yeah, but notice that excludes a person who's willing to ask an uncomfortable question about the racial disparity and to pursue that question in an objective way. On the basis of the evidence that's at hand, which is what I think Charles Murray actually has done. Okay.
On the issue of how performative or how much virtue signaling you may have been doing in that writing, I would encourage you to really take it easy on yourself. I mean, aren't our lives just full of that to one extent or another? I mean, it's true that, like you, I look on social media like Twitter and see things I consider egregious virtue signaling and they drive me nuts. On the other hand, none of us is ever entirely non-performative. I mean, we always have a peer group in mind that we're trying to impress, right?
Sure. I do think that's a part of the human condition, the concern about what it is that others think about ourselves and the management we were just talking about, Irving Goffman, of the impressions that we make on people. So I hope I'm not being so hard on myself that I judge myself for simply being human. On the other hand, there is such a thing as losing your nerve. Okay, there is such a thing as blinking. So let me give another example. That's the California ballot proposition 209, which was on the ballot in 1996 in California, which was enacted, and it banished affirmative action from public admissions to universities, contracting, and public hiring in California. I had been, as a conservative intellectual, for a decade arguing against affirmative action. And in a matter of what was practically a blink of an eye, I found myself in a position where I was chairman of the board of a small group called the Center for New Black Leadership. Clarence Thomas was a big booster of ours behind the scenes. He was on the court, the Supreme Court at that time. He had been there for a few years and he had friends and he was whispering in their ears that they should give us money. Shelby Steele was one of he was like vice chairman of this group. Ariana Huffington, you might be surprised to know, was a member of the board of a conservative Black think tank in 1995, 96, and so on. I was chairman of the board. So this issue comes up, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to go out to California and campaign as Black conservatives alongside Ward Connerly, who was the African-American spearheading this effort in California in the 1990s? Were we going to go public? Was I going to have an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal denouncing affirmative action and whatnot? And I adopted the following position. And I remember arguing this with Justice Thomas in his chambers, and he actually lost his temper with me. My position was affirmative action for Black people is like Israel for Jews. Okay. And, it may be a very bad analogy.
I'd be careful at this point if I were you.
Yeah, okay. All I'm saying is it's a loyalty test issue where if you're a member of the group, people expect you to support it. Okay?
People expect you, yeah.
And if you don't have credibility with them as being really a member in good standing of the group. You can be run out of town on a rail for taking the wrong position on the issue. That's all I mean to say.
Okay.
And to deviate from the group consensus on the issue is kind of like an act of disloyalty. And if we wanted to be credible, the Center for New Black Leadership, arguing with Black people about much more fundamental things, which was if 2 and 3 kids are born to a woman who's not married, the society is not healthy, and that's something we need to attend to, or whatever. Then we couldn't get out there and be flacks for right-wing agitators who are trying to destroy affirmative action. We needed to keep our powder dry on that issue. That was my position. You know that I not only did I lose friendship with people like Justice Thomas and Shelby Steele, I got fired as the chairman of the board. They had a little meeting, and I ended up having to resign from the whole organization because I had taken that issue. And in retrospect, it feels to me like the reason that I did that was the story that I gave you was a cover story. And the real reason that I did that was that I wanted to get back into good graces with the Black community, which had banished me in the 80s because of my conservatism, and then had just completely dismissed me as contemptuous and beneath even discussion because of my public humiliation and scandal. And I was trying to rehabilitate myself. I'm not proud of that.
Okay, but we always have our social reference group, you know, and I guess if what you're saying is that the reference group was entirely determined socially as opposed to actually intellectually, right? Like it had been a social decision to choose the intellectual social reference group. I mean, maybe that's what you're saying.
I used to say to these guys, to my neoconservative friends, I say, everybody's got someplace to go. They're going to Jerusalem, or they're going to Dublin, or they're going to Rome. Everybody's got somewhere to go. I can't go home. I got no place to go. Mm-hmm. Don't begrudge me the sort of visceral need of solidarity with my folk, as it were.
I see.
I got a people too.
Okay. And so you...
But today I would say that was a mistake. That was kind of taking the easy route. That was a giving in to something that I should have been fighting against and should have resisted. I should have had the strength of my convictions, even if I was the only man standing.
Okay, so then what accounts for the subsequent change? What were you reacting to as you moved back to the right?
As I have moved in recent years back to the right, what am I reacting to? So, you know, this deserves probably more thought than I'm going to be able to give it right here. I think part of what I'm reacting to is the post-Obama phenomenon of the way that the racial discourse has, to my mind, become captured by a certain, you know, social mediated hysteria and kind of disconnect from reality. And I see that across a number of different issues. I'm very unhappy about normalization of affirmative action as basically the diversity device. You know, we got to have diverse institutions. We need Blacks. We know that they're not going to have the good test scores. Therefore, we won't look as closely at their test scores and we'll whatever. I don't like the Black Lives Matter, and I could go into details. I've talked about this at length at the Glenn Show, but basically my position is all lives matter. The police are off the hook. To the extent that the police are off the hook, they need to be reined in and they need to be held accountable. Full stop. I don't care what color a cop is that kills a kid. There are white kids that are getting killed by cops in this country, more of them than Black kids that are getting killed by cops, if you can do the counting. So if there's an issue about police and police brutality, it's not mainly a racial issue. Why would you invite a racialization of discussion of crime and punishment in this country? Have you looked at who's in prison? Oh, I see. You think the overrepresentation of Blacks in prison is an indictment of society, do you? You think it's proof of structural racism, do you? Well, I'll tell you what, the median voter in a whole lot of hamlets in this country think it's proof of Black criminality, because the only way you can get into prison in this country is to break the law. Have you seen what it's like to actually live in some of the places where Black criminality is off the hook? I wouldn't want to racialize a discussion about crime and punishment in this country, because there's no way, if you stay in touch with reality, that making it a racial discussion can work out to the credit of Black people. That would be the position that I would take. There are just a lot of things that are like this for me now. Reparations. So people are so smugly comfortable in their phony superior position. They think they're in control of the narrative. They think they got their hand on the moral compass of the culture, and they're wrong, I think. Here's what I mean. There are gaps: the racial wealth gap, the racial income gap, et cetera. There are gaps. Okay, there was slavery. There's not any doubt about it. Jim Crow segregation, a long ignoble history of the denial of the full and equal rights to African Americans by the American state and American society. No doubt about that. Those things are connected. Okay, so I've made 3 stipulations. There are gaps, there's slavery, and they're connected. Now, here we are in 2019. Do you know what it actually would cost you to give $50,000 a head to 35 million people? We're talking trillions. We're talking a Social Security magnitude federal program. Okay, you're going to build such a program in the United States of America in the 21st century on the basis of race? You're going to define a group of recipients based upon race? How are you going to do that without getting into South Africa scale racial accountancy? You're going to build a politics around a multi-trillion-dollar federal commitment based upon the race of the people who receive it? Madness. This is just complete madness, I would say. And yet, the rhetoric coming out of the mouths of Democratic Party presidential candidates and coming out of the mouths of Black intellectuals, in my opinion, fails to notice the problematic character of that kind of a move in American politics. We should be going in exactly the opposite direction. We should be seizing upon the J.D. Vances of the world who want to talk about white poverty, to talk about the general issue in a way that doesn't etch more deeply into the American psyche the differences among its citizens based upon something as superficial as their racial identities, I would say.
So it should be a class issue, as the old left would have framed it.
Yeah, I mean, if I were going to talk about social justice, it should be a class issue that I'm talking about. Yes, that's what I think. But anyway, you asked me about what accounts for my move to the right, and in a way, it's a reaction against the temper of the times, which makes everything that I just said about affirmative action, about crime and punishment, and about reparations, apostasy to people who regard themselves as advocates of Black interests.
Right. I mean, at the same time, we should be clear about the incarceration issue, because for one thing, you were, as you said, raising questions about highlighting how problematic it was that African Americans are disproportionately represented in prisons, and you were highlighting it in ways that I think you would not entirely abandon now. I think
that's correct.
You would agree with you're sticking with a lot of that analysis, and I assume. So first of all, you accept the premise that, look, it's an unhealthy situation when any ethnic group is just grossly disproportionately represented in the prison system, A. And I assume you'd buy a certain amount of what you no doubt hear when you say, wait a second, there's a reason they're in prison, which is, well, yeah, but among the reasons are that the policing system is not focused evenly across all human beings. If you're an upper class white guy who does drugs, you're very unlikely to get caught up in the criminal justice system. If you're a low income Black guy, you're much more likely to get caught up, and so on. So sure. You're granting all that, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. A casual listener would get the wrong impression about that. And I did write that book. It's published in 2008. That's over 10 years ago now. But I don't disavow. I mean, the central argument of that book was, the central moral argument of that book was, yeah, you might have an overrepresentation of Black people, low-income Black people in prison, and it may be in part because of the fact that they did certain actions, but that can't be the end of the moral discussion. It's simply on them. If you have a structure in society of people being marginalized, education doesn't work for them, they don't have employment opportunities, they're segregated in the cities and enclaves, et cetera, then that's not something they had control over to the extent that structure is implicated in the behavioral choices that they make. While they are responsible for their choices, the fact that they're not responsible for the structure, that we as a society are responsible for a structure, means that indirectly we are also partly responsible for their choices.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't disavow that broader critique at all.
As I recall, when you made your debut on Bloggingheads, I think that was in conversation with our friend Josh Cohen. Is that correct?
Oh, that's right. Josh Cohen, your friend and my friend, introduced me to Bloggingheads. He heard Mike give those lectures. He said, "This is interesting. I want to hear more from you."
Right, and it was that issue, right? You had written for his periodical about incarceration as part of your larger interest in it. I think, is that right?
Yeah, no, he was in the audience at Stanford when I gave those lectures in April of 2007. Okay. And then he invited me to come and discuss it with him at Bloggingheads, and we published something in Boston Review after. And the book is a Boston Review MIT Press collaboration.
Okay, so now you're still doing things with Bloggingheads. Specifically, now you have a show called The Glenn Show, and it's really kind of caught on, I gotta say. And you. You tell me how the last few years feels. It seems to me that you have become almost, maybe icon is too strong a word, but you've become a very prominent and sought after spokesperson for a certain perspective. I'm interested, in how much you think Bloggingheads has to do with that, with the gathering momentum, but also in the question of how it feels.
Well, yeah, I think Bloggingheads has a lot to do with it, to be honest with you. The platform, the YouTube channel and all of that, it gets the listeners, viewers that it gets. Maybe not as many as Jordan Peterson.
No, that's
Joe Rogan.
That's all safe to say.
But
is it too late for you to take up mixed martial arts?
I think it probably is.
I think that helped Joe Rogan, but in any event, yeah. Well, also, let's face it. Well, I got to say, you're clearly more cerebral than Joe Rogan's show on average tries to be. And with all due respect for Jordan Peterson, I think you may have an edge on him in that regard. In other words, your audience is to some extent limited by the caliber of discussion, I think. You're an academic.
Thank you.
Well, this is maybe just how I console myself or something about the size of my own audience. But I think in your case, it's, you take the point. I do. I want to say the Bloggingheads has been a big boon to me, and it has given me the opportunity to, with John McWhorter as my conversation partner. Absolutely. That's kind of an anchor. 1 out of every 4 Glenn shows pretty much is a conversation with John, and we're the so-called black guys at bloggingheads.tv, and we have a following. People want to hear from us. And I think some of it has to do with the fact that when we discuss an issue, and it doesn't always have to be race, although it often is, points of view that you wouldn't ordinarily hear, and certainly wouldn't ordinarily hear from African-American spokespersons, are given voice to, such as those that I just got through expressing. Mm-hmm. Call it more conservative. I think sometimes it's not exactly accurately characterized as conservative. It could be contrarian, certainly cutting against the grain. I don't see anything conservative about saying, for example, that if the murder rate in New York City falls from 2,500 in a year to 500 in a year, and if 4/5 of people, or 5/6 of them murdered in New York City in a given year are Black and Hispanic, then that's a good thing for Black people, that the murder rate is down from 2,000 plus to under 500. That's a very good thing for Black people. And if that happened in part by the agency of the New York City Police Department, then those people are acting on behalf of the interest of Black people to the extent that they do what's necessary to get that murder rate down. I don't regard that as a conservative statement at all, but that's the kind of thing. Or to say, and John and I get into arguments about stuff, we don't always have the same view, but those arguments will be enlightening, I think, to people in that they will show different, reactions to events that are taking place, whether it's Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to be a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, or it's Donald Trump somehow managing to get himself elected president of the United States in 2016. Yeah. Don't know if I want to get into Trump. I'm tempted.
But you asked me how it feels, and it feels really good. It feels good to be mentioned. I mean, I get mail from people saying, you're a lifesaver. Thank God for you. You're a national treasure. I mean, and even if it's only the, demented, lonely person that sits there in front of their laptop listening to my blog post who then feels like they have to write a love letter, it feels pretty good to be called a national treasure, to be told, please keep doing what you're doing. We're dependent on it, to be told, you've changed my life. Listening to you has given me a whole new outlook on things. And I get those kind of notes from people all the time.
Do you ever worry that it feels too good? The reason I ask is because you have looking back, you've critiqued the way, you handled this period of kind of when you had, I guess, a certain amount of adulation from the left, or certainly affirmation, and you feel in retrospect you catered to it too much. Do you worry about audience capture now?
Yeah, the comments at the Bloggingheads site are different from the comments at the YouTube post of our.
An interesting fact. Yeah, how would you characterize the difference?
Well, the Bloggingheads community, I think, is more self-consciously progressive, and there are a lot of comments that I get at YouTube that look like they could be coming from alt-right or that kind of source, and I don't see that at Bloggingheads at all. And sometimes when, some of these guys end up patting me on the back at YouTube saying, oh, you're right on, I wonder, oh, my God, what did I say that made that guy think that I was so right on? Because when he goes on in paragraph 2 to tell me what he thinks, I'm like appalled at what he thinks I must think. What does he think that I think if he finds comfort in listening to me? I'm giving aid and comfort to the wrong people, I sometimes think. So yeah, that definitely is an issue.
I know that feeling. So yeah, no, you've I think your show has become intellectually and culturally very significant thing. You usher people on to the stage. What's the name of that student at Columbia who you had on?
His name is Coleman Hughes.
Right. I'd never heard of him before I saw you talk to him, and now I see more of him.
Yeah, he's a phenomenon. He is indeed. He's an African-American undergraduate and going into his senior year at Columbia who's, amongst his accolades is that he was testifying before the Congress of the United States at the hearings that the House held on the reparations issue. He was one of the people at the witness table giving his testimony, along with the fabled Ta-Nehisi Coates on the other side of the issue. I
saw that. Now, Ta-Nehisi was on Bloggingheads once, but he's never been in conversation with you. Is that right?
That's true, and I've invited him, and I'll just reiterate the invitation out there. Should he or his people happen to hear it, he's welcome at the Glenn Show anytime. Would love to have him on. I've read We Were 8 Years in Power. In fact, I've put it on my reading list for my undergraduate course here at Brown on race and inequality. I mean, it's not the only thing on the reading list, but it's on the reading list, and we're going to read 4 or 5 chapters from it. His essay on reparations will be one of them. I'd love to be able to talk with him about the significance of the Obama presidency, although it's getting a little bit old now, or about the pervasiveness of racism as the factor controlling the fate of African Americans, or whether or not patriotism makes sense for Black people. I propose that as a topic of discussion that Coates and I could kick around. I would take the affirmative on that. I would say Black people should be patriotic. I would say American nationalism is not the enemy of African American interests. Rightly understood.
That's an interesting proposition. I mean, I am somewhat ambivalent about national allegiance generically, but I mean, you know what I mean, right? I mean, it's some bad things have been done in the name of national identity, and I would encourage people to be, circumspect about and self-conscious about the reasons for their allegiance.
Okay, the other side, I don't disagree with that, but just let me say, if you want to have a robust welfare state, a really thick safety,
absolutely,
you want everybody to have health care, you want college to be affordable, et cetera, you'd better have some solidarity at the national level. Otherwise, I don't know how you get that done.
No, I agree. And I mean, first of all, look, for a long time to come and maybe forever, I think we need a lot more in the way of global governance, but nation states are going to be the units of that. They have to be able to act purposively ideally maybe more wisely than they sometimes act, but they're going to be the units, A, and then B, as you note, they are the vehicles and will be for some time for addressing certain particular kinds of problems. And I think we'd agree that the failure to address some of these problems may account for why Donald Trump is in office. Whatever you think of him, you personally, Glenn, may think somewhat less negatively of him than I do, although I know you have your criticisms. But yeah, I think we'd agree that if the nation had been a more effective vehicle for addressing things that were clearly national issues, he might well not be in office. Yeah, we do agree about that. So, well, as for guests, I mean, if you think of any other people on the left, aside from Ta-Nehisi, who... Well, I'll tell you someone who I'd love to talk to. That's Adolph Reed, the political scientist who's at Penn. I believe he's still at Penn, and who writes about race issues. He's a Marxist. He's a very smart guy. He was on Michael Brooks's show. Michael Brooks is a big fan of his. Have you approached him, or should we approach him for you? No, you can approach him on my behalf. I only have a very casual acquaintance with him, and last time I saw him, I believe, would have been at Yale Law School in 1988 or something crazy like that. So, okay, but he's been around for a while. But he's a formidable guy. I'm sure he wouldn't like my neoliberalism, but he might appreciate some of my skepticism about the direction of Black politics these days. Well, his analysis might be more class based than that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, I guess has this been about an hour now? It has been. Well, anything else you want to say about your autobiography? Are you calling it an autobiography or a? I'm calling it a memoir. You're calling it a memoir. Yeah. I'm not sure what the difference is even supposed to be. Is there a difference of connotation? Well, a memoir can be focused on a particular aspect of your life without attempting to be a comprehensive account of your life. Right. Well, in fact, that's what a memoir is. I was told by a very fine writer who I respect a lot. She said to me, just be clear. You're not trying to tell everything. Know what you're trying to say here. You're using your life as a vehicle for trying to convey something. What's your message? Can you please say? It's not that I was born in 1948, et cetera, et cetera. It needs to be something else. And changing my mind, the capacity to be able to scrutinize oneself, to be honest with oneself, to have the courage to admit error, to have to, because when you change your mind, you lose friends. You betray people. They counted on you. They thought you were in their corner. Like that. That's my message. That's the thing that I want to by the way, changing your mind could be, I used to be happy feeling that good feeling from the rush of the cocaine hit that I would take. Mm-hmm. And now I realize that is no way to live. It debases my humanity. It's beneath me. And I have to elevate myself above that. And that's easier said than done by a long shot. You mean it's hard to get out of the grip of drugs? Is that what you mean? That's what I mean. It's easy to say and it's hard to do. By the way, confessing belief in the divinity of Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, going from a rationalist with a PhD in a technical subject to a guy who's genuflecting at the altar of the magic, in the sky kind of stuff like that. That's a big mind shift. And then coming out of that and recognizing that there was a heavy dose of self-delusion, perhaps necessary to dealing with the crisis in one's life at a point in time, but it didn't stick. And what do I do now? And what about the people who believed me when I gave my Christian testimony and my witness, and who were brought into a relationship with the Almighty in part because of my example, having to see me in my apostasy? What about them? I've betrayed them, haven't I? Are you in touch with any of them? Yeah, including the pastor who led me to Christ. Are you in touch with people you led to Christ who are still? No, I know such people exist, and I've gotten the occasional letter from somebody who said, in effect, "Don't give up on Jesus. He hasn't given up on you." And how are your relations with this pastor? Very, very good and respectful, although we don't talk theology. Mm-hmm. But you do think that maybe you couldn't have gotten away from drugs without religion?
I think perhaps I couldn't have gotten away from drugs without religion. I'm not sure what's cause and what's effect. Maybe it was the getting away from drugs that drove me to religion as much as it was religion that helped me get away from drugs. The two things are very, in my biography, very closely connected with one another.
Do you still believe that there's a higher purpose, or is there any kind of abstract representation of religious belief that you still adhere to or at least take seriously?
No, no is the answer to that question. I don't affirm any such thing. All that's left is a deep respect for people who are trying to achieve that. I don't look down at them. I don't belittle them. I get pissed when I see the atheist showing contempt for people who are actually struggling with this aspect of our human existence, which is so profound. There's mystery. There's stuff that I don't know. So I don't have patience with the people who are just these aggressive, dismissive atheists. But there's not something I can affirm. Only respect for people who are still struggling with it.
By affirm, you mean believe with great confidence and conviction.
Yeah, that's right. Something that I can believe.
Okay. Well, look, it sounds to me like your memoir is actually pretty well under control, whether you know it or not. You've definitely got a story there. You're capable of articulating it in an entertaining fashion. And so I say, fix the typos and send it off to your publisher, Glenn.
Okay, Bob. I've gotten that advice from other people too. Let it go, man.
Including your publisher. Do you have a publisher yet?
I do not have a publisher yet. I have an agent, and she's chomping at the bit.
I'll bet. This will be interesting. I think this will get a lot of attention. So, and you should certainly get it done before you undergo another swing of the ideological pendulum. I mean, you'll have to reconsider the whole damn thing. Please don't move to the left, Glenn. Get the book out.
All right. Yes, sir. Will do.
Okay. So we'll encourage people who aren't now watching the Glenn Show to watch it or listen to it if they haven't been. And we'll try to get some of these lefty guests on to argue with you. And thanks so much for all the time you've put into it over the years, Glenn.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Bob. It's been it's been one of the happy things in my life doing these posts for Bloggingheads. And I'll be coming back to you in a few weeks with a suggestion for a conversation where I ask the questions and you give the answers.
Okay. Yeah. The knowledge that might happen kept me. I was reasonably nice to you, right?
Yeah, you were okay. Yeah, I mean,
there's a game. This is an iterated game that incentivizes me to be nice. I tried to be nice. You'll be nice, right?
I'll be nice.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Glenn.
You're welcome, Bob.
Take care.
Bye-bye.